He had always been a man of quiet habits. His life was simple, orderly, and predictable, the kind of life many people quietly wished for but rarely achieved. He woke up early, made himself a cup of strong coffee, and spent the first few minutes of the day sitting on his porch, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. The morning light would filter softly through the leaves, and he would watch as the neighborhood slowly came to life. Children ran to the bus stop, neighbors exchanged greetings across white picket fences, and dogs barked playfully in backyards. To an outsider, it looked like a peaceful, ordinary life, but behind those calm, unassuming eyes lay a depth few could ever imagine. He had chosen this neighborhood for its quiet streets and friendly people. The houses were modest but well kept, lawns neatly trimmed, flowers blooming along sidewalks. It was a place where people still waved at each other and helped neighbors carry groceries or fix a leaky pipe. He liked this sense of community, even if he mostly kept to himself. He had learned over the years that there was comfort in routine, in the predictability of small everyday tasks. During the day, he worked at a local repair shop. People knew him as reliable, competent, and polite. He didn't talk much about his past or personal life, but those who knew him trusted him implicitly. He had a calm presence, the kind that made people feel safe even if they didn't fully understand why. On his days off, he liked to take walks around the neighborhood or tend to the small vegetable garden he had planted in the backyard. It was his way of staying grounded, of reminding himself that life could be simple, even after everything he had seen and experienced. But that calm life was about to be shattered in ways he could never have predicted. One evening, just as the sun was setting and painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, he noticed unusual sounds outside. At first, he thought it was kids playing or someone working late in a nearby yard, but the noises grew louder, sharper, more threatening. There was shouting, glass breaking, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps pounding on the driveway. He walked to the window and saw a group of people gathered around his house. They were strangers, yet their faces twisted with anger and hatred. They didn't seem to care who was inside. Their words were cruel, dripping with bigotry and rage, targeting everything he represented. His heart sank as he realized what was happening. They were here to terrorize him, to destroy the sense of safety he had built around himself. At first, he froze. Shock paralyzed him for a moment. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the scene. The group was breaking windows, tearing down shutters and leaving hateful symbols across the walls. His front door had been kicked in and the inside of the house was being trashed. They overturned furniture, smashed decorations, and even destroyed some of the things he had cherished for years. The sound was deafening, the sight unbearable, and yet, amid the chaos, he remained calm, almost eerily so. It wasn't that he was fearless. Far from it. His heart pounded in his chest and a cold sweat ran down his back. But he had learned long ago that panic only made situations worse. He had seen what uncontrolled fear could do, how it could cloud judgment and lead to mistakes. He took a deep breath, forcing his mind to focus, to analyze the situation logically. He had to survive this moment and find a way to protect himself. The vandals shouted at him, taunting and jeering, trying to provoke a reaction. They had no idea who they were dealing with. To them, he was just another man, another target for their hate-fueled aggression. They didn't know about the life he had lived before settling into this quiet existence. They didn't know that the calm, ordinary man they were attacking was someone who had trained his body and mind to a level of precision and control that most people couldn't even imagine. But at that moment, he didn't reveal anything. He didn't move too quickly, didn't confront them with force. Instead, he observed, taking mental notes of their numbers, their behavior, and the patterns of their movement. He knew that rash action could escalate the situation and put him in greater danger. He had faced countless life-threatening scenarios before, and he understood that patience, strategy, and control were far more powerful than anger or brute force. The group finally left, leaving behind a trail of destruction. His home was wrecked, his sanctuary violated, and his sense of security shattered. He walked through the wreckage slowly, carefully, inspecting every corner, every broken piece. The sight was devastating. The walls he had painted, the furniture he had arranged with care, the personal belongings he had treasured for years, all of it was damaged or destroyed. It was more than material loss. It was an assault on his sense of peace, his home, the very foundation of his daily life. Neighbors began to gather, offering what little comfort they could. Some expressed sympathy, while others whispered about the boldness and cruelty of the attack. He thanked them politely but didn't let their presence sway his mind from the task at hand. He had to think clearly. He had to consider his options carefully. Reporting the incident to the authorities was necessary, but he knew that they might not act quickly enough. The attackers were bold, violent, and dangerous, and they would likely strike again if nothing was done to stop them. As he stood among the ruins of his home, memories of his past life quietly surfaced. Memories he had buried deep under the layers of a peaceful existence. Memories of rigorous training, intense discipline, and missions that demanded every ounce of skill and intelligence he possessed. He remembered the long nights, the careful planning, the precise execution of operations that few could imagine. Every lesson learned in those years was now quietly reshaping his approach to the present crisis. He didn't act on these memories immediately. Instead, he allowed himself a moment of grief, a moment to acknowledge the pain, the anger, and the sense of violation. He knew that controlling these emotions was critical. Reacting impulsively could be dangerous, not only to himself but also to those around him. He reminded himself that true strength was not shown through immediate retaliation, but through careful, deliberate action. Night fell, and the neighborhood slowly returned to silence. The chaos of the attack had passed, but the tension remained. He secured what remained of his home as best he could, locking doors, boarding broken windows, and preparing for the possibility that the group might return. Even in this moment of vulnerability, he remained vigilant, his mind sharp, his senses alert. Every shadow, every sound, every movement outside his home was scrutinized. In the quiet of that night, as he sat in the dim light of a single lamp, he reflected on the strange irony of his situation. Here he was, a man who had faced unimaginable danger in his past, now confronted by a group of people who believed they could intimidate him. They had no idea what they were up against. They saw only the surface, the calm exterior, the quiet man in the neighborhood. They could not perceive the layers of training, skill, and experience beneath. He understood that his life would never be the same after this. The attack had changed something fundamental. It was no longer just a violation of property. It was a challenge, a call to action, a reminder that he could not ignore threats to his safety and dignity. Yet even with this realization, he remained measured. He would not let rage dictate his actions. He would not act recklessly. He would plan, he would wait, and when the time was right, he would respond with precision and control, just as he had been trained to do. As he drifted to sleep that night, his mind was already working, cataloging every detail of the attack, every observation about the intruders, and every possible way to protect himself and restore his peace. He was calm on the outside, but inside a quiet storm was gathering. This was not the beginning of fear or chaos. It was the beginning of action, of a response that would be deliberate, calculated, and effective. He did not know when the group would return or what they might do next, but he knew one thing for certain. They had awakened something in him, something they could not comprehend. The quiet life they had tried to destroy had been a mask, a way to live peacefully among people who could not understand his true nature. But masks could be removed when necessary, and skills that had been dormant could rise again when the situation demanded. By morning, he was ready. The sun rose over the neighborhood, casting its light over broken windows, overturned furniture, and the signs of the hateful attack. But in the midst of destruction, there was also determination. The man who had been shaken, violated, and challenged would face this situation with the full measure of his experience and ability. He was calm, prepared, and quietly resolute. The attack had not broken him. It had only revealed the hidden strength that lay beneath his ordinary exterior. He stepped outside, breathing in the crisp morning air. He surveyed the damage, noting details that might help identify the vandals, and began thinking about the next steps. There was a plan forming in his mind, a way to respond that would be both just and effective. He did not seek vengeance for the sake of anger. He sought resolution, protection, and the restoration of peace, not only for himself, but for the neighborhood that he still cherished. Even as neighbors offered their support and condolences, they could not imagine the storm that lay beneath his calm exterior. Them, he was simply a man who had suffered an attack yet remained composed. They did not know that he was someone who had faced danger far greater than any group of vandals, someone who had trained to survive, adapt, and overcome situations that would terrify most people. And so, with the wreckage of his home around him, and the memory of the night's events fresh in his mind, he began the first steps toward reclaiming his life. The quiet man who had lived peacefully in a simple neighborhood was no longer just a bystander. He was preparing to take control, to ensure that justice would be served, and to remind the world, and those who had tried to terrorize him, that appearances could be deceiving. He had always been careful about what he shared with the world. People saw only what he allowed them to see. A quiet man, polite, disciplined, with a life as ordinary as any neighbor's. Few had any idea of the life he had lived before moving into this calm neighborhood. It was a life marked by danger, secrecy, and skills that could save lives or take them. Those memories had been buried for years, tucked away behind a mask of normalcy. But now, in the aftermath of the attack on his home, those memories began to surface. He sat quietly in his damaged living room, staring at the wreckage, and let the past rise in his mind like a tide. He remembered the long, grueling days of training, where every part of him had been pushed to the limit. His body had been tested in ways most people could never imagine. Running, swimming, climbing, crawling through mud and water, under the burning sun and freezing cold. But it wasn't just physical. His mind had been sharpened, taught to think clearly under pressure, to anticipate danger before it arrived, and to make decisions in a split second that could determine life or death. He remembered the discipline that had been drilled into him. Every move had to be precise, every action deliberate. There was no room for hesitation. Failure was not an option because the stakes were always high. Lives depended on him and the people around him. He recalled missions in remote places, where the difference between success and disaster could be a single step, a single decision. He had faced enemies who wanted to kill him, challenges that would break most men, and yet he had survived. Not because he was reckless, but because he had learned to remain calm, to control fear, and to use it as a tool rather than a weakness. Now, years later, those lessons felt almost dormant, hidden under the layers of a life built to be peaceful and normal. He had chosen this quiet neighborhood, the modest house, the simple routines, in order to leave that life behind, or at least to keep it separate from the world he now inhabited. He had wanted to experience a life where he could drink coffee without thinking about danger, where he could garden without worrying about enemies, where he could live without masks, codes, and constant vigilance. Yet, as he looked around at the destruction in his home, he realized that the past could never be fully buried. The attack had shaken more than his house. It had touched a part of him that had been waiting quietly for a situation that would require it. He understood instinctively that he couldn't ignore the threat. The people who had attacked him were bold, violent, and driven by hatred. They did not see the man in front of them, only the image they wanted to destroy. They did not know that they had targeted someone capable of far more than they could imagine. He thought back to his decision to leave that life behind. It had not been easy. The work he had done before moving here had been dangerous, yes, but it had also given him purpose. He had saved lives, protected people, and served his country in ways that few could comprehend. But the constant risk, the secrecy, and the relentless pressure had taken their toll. He had wanted normalcy, peace, and the freedom to live without the weight of extraordinary responsibility pressing down on him every day. This neighborhood, these walls, this small orderly life, they had been his refuge. Yet now that refuge had been violated, and the calm he had carefully cultivated was threatened. He realized that he could not simply return to the routines he had built. Something had changed. The quiet life he had worked so hard to achieve was no longer enough. The attack was a reminder that the world could intrude at any moment, and that sometimes, ordinary appearances could not shield someone from danger. As he cleaned up broken glass and stacked damaged furniture, he also began to plan. His mind, trained for years to strategize under pressure, worked quickly. He assessed the attackers' methods, their likely motivations, and the risks they posed if they returned. He thought about the neighborhood, the people who lived here, and how the presence of such hatred threatened not only him but everyone around him. He understood that he could not allow fear to control the situation. Fear had to be acknowledged, yes, but it could never dictate his actions. He began to consider his options carefully. Going directly to the authorities was necessary, but he also knew their response might be slow or inadequate. He needed evidence, documentation, and a clear understanding of the people he was dealing with. At the same time, he could not reveal everything about himself. The world did not need to know the full extent of his past. Only those who posed a threat did. That thought brought a quiet, grim satisfaction. The attackers had no idea what they had provoked. They had chosen the wrong man to intimidate. His past had taught him patience. He remembered missions where rushing in had been fatal, where observation and calculation had been the difference between success and failure. He applied those lessons now, watching from the shadows, noting the comings and goings of the vandals, their habits and their weaknesses. He moved quietly, deliberately ensuring that every action he took was controlled and precise. The skills that had once been necessary in the most extreme conditions were now tools to protect his home and his community. He also reflected on his sense of identity. For so long he had separated the man he was now from the man he had been, but the attack forced him to recognize that the two were not separate at all. They were different aspects of the same person. The calm, ordinary man and the trained, disciplined operative existed together, and each had value. One provided peace and stability, the other provided protection and strength. Both were essential, and both would now be necessary to navigate the challenge before him. Even as he planned, he allowed himself moments of vulnerability. He acknowledged the fear, the anger, and the sorrow. The attack had been personal, and the violation of his home cut deep. But he did not let these emotions overwhelm him. Instead, he channeled them into focus, using the energy they provided to sharpen his thinking and refine his strategy. He knew that true power came not from suppression of emotion, but from mastery over it. He also began to consider the moral dimension of his actions. The attackers were dangerous, yes, but he was not a man who sought unnecessary violence. His goal was to protect himself, his property, and the neighborhood. He would not act recklessly or out of vengeance. Every step he took would be calculated, deliberate, and designed to prevent further harm while ensuring justice. That balance between strength and restraint had been a core principle of his training, and it now guided his decisions. As days passed, he began to move with purpose. He documented the damage, noted details that could help identify the attackers, and observed their behavior from a safe distance. Every action was deliberate, every observation carefully recorded. He remained outwardly calm, even friendly, when interacting with neighbors or authorities, giving no hint of the capabilities he possessed. Yet beneath the surface, his mind was active, analyzing every detail, preparing for the moment when decisive action would be necessary. The quiet, ordinary life he had built had given him peace, yes, but it had also provided the perfect cover. The attackers had underestimated him, and that underestimation would become their weakness. They had assumed he was powerless, that he would react with fear or anger. But he knew that true strength lay in patience, observation, and careful planning. They had unknowingly challenged a man whose abilities far exceeded anything they could imagine. At night he would sit in the darkened living room, listening to the neighborhood settle into silence. Each creak of the house, each distant sound was analyzed and catalogued. He reviewed every detail of the attack, every movement he had observed, and every lesson from his past that could be applied to the present. The memory of his training was vivid. Every drill, every scenario, every critical decision replayed in his mind, sharpening his instincts and reinforcing his focus. And yet he remained human. He felt fear, frustration, and sorrow. He missed the sense of normalcy he had once taken for granted. He missed the simple pleasure of sitting in his yard without the shadow of danger looming overhead. But he also recognized that these emotions, properly managed, were part of what made him strong. They were reminders of what he valued, what he fought to protect, and why he could not afford to act recklessly. In the quiet moments, he also reflected on the irony of his situation. The life he had left behind, once so consuming and dangerous, now seemed almost dormant, but it had left him with tools, knowledge, and strength that would serve him well. The attackers believed they had found an ordinary man, someone they could intimidate and scare. They could not have been more wrong. Beneath the calm exterior was a person capable of extraordinary focus, resilience, and action. He understood that the next steps would define the course of the days ahead. He would act, yes, but he would act strategically. He would protect his home, safeguard his neighbors, and ensure that the vandals could not strike again. But he would do so in a way that was controlled, measured, and intelligent. He was not a man driven by vengeance or anger. He was a man driven by principle, by discipline, and by the need to restore peace. By the time the sun rose again over the neighborhood, he had already begun preparing. His calm, ordinary life had been disrupted, but it had also awakened a part of him that had been waiting. The quiet man who had once been content with a simple routine was now ready to respond to a challenge that would test every skill, every instinct, and every lesson he had learned. He was ready, not to fight recklessly, but to act with precision. He was ready to protect what he valued most, his home, his peace, and the neighborhood that had become his sanctuary. And as the morning light touched the broken walls and scattered belongings, it revealed not only destruction but also determination, resilience, and the quiet, formidable strength of a man who had learned to survive and to triumph against all odds. After the attack, he realized that acting without a plan would be dangerous. The people who had targeted him were reckless, driven by anger and hate, and they were unpredictable. Rushing into a confrontation could put him in real danger. Instead, he decided to watch, to learn, and to gather information. He needed to understand who they were, how they operated, and when they might strike again. This was not about revenge yet. It was about being ready, being aware, and making sure that if they returned, he would not be caught off guard. He started by inspecting the neighborhood in a way that seemed casual to anyone passing by. Walking down the streets, greeting neighbors politely, and pretending to do ordinary tasks, he was quietly observing the world around him. He took note of patterns, the times when certain streets were empty, the movements of people who seemed suspicious, the sounds that might indicate someone lurking nearby. Everything mattered. Every detail could provide a clue. At night, he would sit in his living room listening to the smallest noises outside. A car door closing, footsteps on gravel, the hum of distant traffic. He noted each sound and analyzed it. His past training had taught him to trust his senses, to pay attention even to what others would ignore. In the darkness, he imagined possible scenarios, practiced responses in his mind, and planned the safest ways to move if confrontation became unavoidable. Each step was calculated, each thought purposeful. He also reviewed the damage to his house again, looking for details that the vandals might have left behind. Broken glass, scuff marks, footprints, even the graffiti, they all told a story. He photographed everything, documented the sequence of destruction, and cataloged any clues that could later be used by authorities. While he appeared calm, internally he was methodical, thinking like someone who had spent years solving problems where lives hung in the balance. The more he observed, the more he realized that the vandals were sloppy. Their hatred had made them careless, reckless, and predictable. They returned to the same locations, made the same mistakes, and failed to cover their tracks. To anyone else it would seem random, but to him it revealed patterns, weaknesses, and openings. It reminded him of his past missions, where studying the enemy, noticing subtle behaviors, and predicting movements could mean the difference between life and death. He also considered the people around him, the neighbors. Some had expressed sympathy, others fear, and some had even suggested moving out. But he knew that leaving was not an option. Retreating would only encourage the vandals and allow them to continue their attacks, not only on him but potentially on others. Protecting the neighborhood became as much a priority as protecting himself. He wanted to reclaim not only his home, but also the peace that the attackers had tried to steal. During the day, he acted completely ordinary. He mowed the lawn, fixed a neighbor's fence, and went about his work with the appearance of a man trying to resume his normal life. But every action was carefully monitored, every detail noted. When he passed by the spots where the vandals were likely to gather, he watched them discreetly. He memorized faces, counted their numbers, and observed interactions. He was building a mental map of the situation, preparing for the day when he would need to act decisively. Sometimes he would encounter suspicious individuals who noticed him looking their way. In those moments, he would smile politely, nod, and continue walking, revealing nothing of what he was thinking or what he knew. His calm demeanor was a weapon in itself. The attackers had expected fear, and instead they found quiet observation. They underestimated him, and that underestimation would soon work in his favor. He also began to anticipate the attackers' next moves. People like them often had predictable habits. They would strike when they felt safe, when their target seemed vulnerable. They would brag, taunt, or act with overconfidence, assuming that no one could stop them. He used this knowledge to plan contingencies, thinking through each possible scenario. If they returned at night, during the day, in a group, or alone, he considered it all. Each scenario had a response, and he mentally rehearsed it repeatedly until every detail was ingrained. While planning, he also worked on his own emotional state. The attack had been personal, and he felt anger and hurt, but he could not let those emotions control him. He reminded himself that patience, focus, and strategy would achieve far more than impulsive retaliation. His past had taught him that true strength was not shown through immediate action or brute force, but through calm calculation and precise execution. Every time he felt frustration rise, he breathed deeply, grounded himself, and returned to observation. During this period, he also strengthened his home. He repaired broken windows, reinforced doors, and took precautions to make the house more secure. Nothing flashy or obvious, he didn't want to draw attention, but every improvement increased safety and gave him confidence. It was another way to take control of a situation that had once made him feel powerless. Each small adjustment was a step toward reclaiming his home and his sense of security. Neighbors continued to watch him with curiosity. They noticed his quiet determination but had no idea of the depth behind it. They assumed he was a man trying to cope with the aftermath, a man reacting to a crime. What they didn't see was the careful planning, the analysis, and the mental rehearsal happening behind calm eyes. They didn't know that the ordinary man they saw walking down the street was someone whose experience and training made him formidable beyond imagination. As days turned into weeks, the tension in the neighborhood grew. Rumors about the vandals spread and fear lingered in the air. Yet amidst the tension, he remained a figure of quiet stability. He became a subtle anchor for the community, someone who, despite the chaos, projected calm. That calm was deliberate. It was a signal to himself and to others that panic or rash action would not solve the problem. It was also a reflection of the discipline and control he had cultivated over years of training and life experience. In private, he analyzed the attackers' behavior further. He noticed patterns in their movement, weaknesses in their organization, and mistakes that could be exploited. They were bold, yes, but careless. Their aggression was fueled by hatred, not intelligence. They acted impulsively, leaving traces that revealed their methods and habits. For someone with his skill set, these patterns were invaluable. They allowed him to anticipate moves, predict actions, and prepare responses that could neutralize the threat without unnecessary risk. He also considered timing carefully. He understood that patience was as much a weapon as skill. Acting too soon, too aggressively could alert the attackers, cause them to flee, or provoke retaliation that could endanger others. He waited, biding his time, ensuring that each step he planned would be executed with precision. This was not hesitation, it was strategy. The longer he observed, the more confident he became in his understanding of the situation, and the better prepared he was to respond effectively. Throughout this period, he remained deeply human. He felt fear, anxiety, and even moments of doubt. The attack had shaken him, and it would have been natural to act purely out of anger or frustration. But he chose not to. He acknowledged his emotions, accepted them, and used them to fuel clarity rather than chaos. It was this combination of humanity and discipline that gave him an advantage. He could feel, plan, and act all at once. In quiet moments, he also thought about the people who had attacked him. They were motivated by ignorance and hatred, blind to the reality of the world around them. They underestimated what it meant to confront someone with experience, skill, and calm intelligence. He reflected on the irony that they had sought to intimidate a man who had faced far greater dangers and had survived them all. Their arrogance was their weakness, and he intended to use it to his advantage. He prepared for multiple scenarios. What if they returned at night? During the day? Alone or in a group? Every possibility had a response. He considered the safest ways to protect himself while ensuring that the vandals could not harm others. He practiced mental drills, walking through actions in his mind, envisioning outcomes and refining each plan. This mental preparation gave him confidence, turning anxiety into focus and fear into readiness. Even as he planned, he continued to live among neighbors, helping where he could, keeping up appearances. He mowed lawns, repaired fences, and greeted people politely. He didn't want suspicion, and he didn't want attention. He needed to remain invisible, a quiet observer until the right moment came. The attackers believed he was ordinary. They believed he was vulnerable. That belief would soon work in his favor. He also started thinking about the larger implications. The attack had been personal, but it was part of a bigger problem. People in the neighborhood could be targets, and ignorance and hatred could spread if left unchecked. Protecting himself was one thing, but he also felt a sense of responsibility to ensure that no one else became a victim. This sense of responsibility strengthened his resolve. His actions would not only restore his home but also protect the community that had become his sanctuary. As he continued to observe, he noticed subtle shifts in the attackers' behavior. They were growing bolder in some ways but also leaving more traces of carelessness. Their overconfidence made them vulnerable, and he mentally cataloged each mistake. He realized that they were predictable, and predictability was something he could exploit. His mind worked like a chessboard, planning moves several steps ahead, always anticipating and preparing for the unexpected. He also reflected on the contrast between his current life and his past. Before, danger had been constant, unavoidable, and immediate. Now danger was present but less intense, giving him time to plan, observe, and act strategically. This difference allowed him to apply his training with clarity, using patience and intelligence rather than brute strength or immediate reaction. The situation was dangerous, yes, but it was also an opportunity to demonstrate the power of careful, deliberate action. By the end of the third week, he had mapped the attacker's habits, weaknesses, and likely behaviors. He had secured his home, strengthened his mental and emotional state, and prepared for the moment when action would be necessary. The quiet man in the neighborhood was no longer simply reacting. He was ready, focused, and in control. The stage was set. The vandals had no idea what was coming. They believed they were untouchable, that they could continue their reign of intimidation, but they were about to discover that appearances could be deceiving. He understood that patience was not inactivity. Every observation, every plan, every moment of quiet reflection was part of a larger strategy. He had learned that rushing or acting impulsively could lead to failure, but careful preparation could turn even a dangerous situation into an opportunity for resolution. He had turned fear into focus, chaos into planning, and uncertainty into strategy, and through it all, he had maintained his humanity, his morality, and his commitment to protect, not to harm unnecessarily. Days of quiet observation had given him a clear picture of the vandals' habits, patterns, and weaknesses. Now he knew it was time to move from watching to taking action, but not recklessly. Everything had to be deliberate, precise, and controlled. He was not motivated by revenge. He was motivated by justice, safety, and the need to reclaim the peace that had been stolen from his home and his neighborhood. He began by thinking carefully about timing. The vandals were predictable. They struck at certain times, moved in groups of 3 or 4, and were careless when they believed no one was watching. He decided he would use that predictability to his advantage. Rushing into a confrontation could be dangerous. Acting impulsively would put him at risk. Instead, he would prepare the environment, anticipate their moves, and allow their own mistakes to guide the outcome. The first step was reinforcement. He strengthened the remaining weak points of his home. Doors were secured, windows reinforced, and the property was made harder to access. But he did so subtly, nothing obvious, nothing that would alert the vandals to his preparation. It was a quiet, invisible defense, giving him confidence and control without tipping his hand. He moved through the house with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this before, placing barriers and safeguards, and visualizing how each part of the house could protect him if confrontation came. At the same time, he began collecting evidence more strategically. Cameras were installed discreetly, and the area around the house was monitored for any unusual movement. Broken items and graffiti had been documented, and he now focused on capturing real-time information. He understood that concrete proof would be crucial if the vandals' actions escalated or if authorities needed to act. But more than proof, it was also a tool of strategy. Knowing where they were and what they were doing before they knew he was aware gave him a significant advantage. He moved carefully through the neighborhood, blending in with routine tasks. He took walks, talked to neighbors casually, and appeared to be returning to normal life. But every glance, every gesture, every sound was being analyzed. He memorized faces, noted subtle behavioral changes, and refined his understanding of who the vandals were and how they operated. This was not about fear. This was about preparation. Every piece of information would allow him to act decisively, safely, and effectively when the moment arrived. He began planning a series of non-confrontational maneuvers to disrupt the vandals' confidence. Small, subtle actions that did not require violence, but would make them question their safety and control. For example, leaving evidence of observation in places they might notice, blocking access to areas they had used, and creating barriers that slowed them down. Each step was designed to weaken their sense of power, making them cautious and less confident without direct conflict. Observation became even more critical. He tracked their movements from a distance, noting times, behaviors, and tendencies. Some of the vandals had habits that were easy to predict. They would gather at the same spot, speak carelessly, and make noise when they thought no one was around. Every mistake they made was noted and cataloged. He began creating mental scenarios, practicing responses in his mind, and preparing contingencies for every possible outcome. He also began refining his personal readiness. He exercised, maintained alertness, and kept his body conditioned. Not that he needed to demonstrate strength, he had long since mastered that. But physical readiness gave him confidence and ensured he could respond quickly if a situation escalated. His mind and body were working together, a combination of preparation and instinct honed through years of training and discipline. As days passed, the vandals began to notice subtle changes. Perhaps they sensed someone watching, perhaps they felt uneasy, or perhaps it was their own paranoia rising. They became slightly more cautious, less confident, and more reckless in other ways. Their overconfidence had made them predictable, but now that predictability was paired with insecurity, he used that insecurity to manipulate the environment without ever revealing his presence. Every small action, every adjustment in the neighborhood was calculated to destabilize their confidence while maintaining his own calm. He also considered timing and escalation. He knew that confronting them directly could be dangerous. Instead, he planned indirect actions, ways to ensure that the vandals' next moves could be observed, documented, and ultimately controlled. He imagined various scenarios. They could come at night, they could strike during the day, they could work in groups or alone. For each possibility, he had a plan, a response, and a way to ensure safety for himself and his neighbors. Despite the careful planning, he remained deeply human. He felt the anger and frustration of having his home destroyed. He felt the violation, the fear, and the urge to act impulsively. But he had learned that true power came from restraint, from turning emotion into focus rather than reaction. Every moment of observation, every preparation was a way to channel those feelings into a tool for control. Anger did not drive him, it sharpened his mind. He also observed the community. Neighbors were cautious but curious. Some expressed concern, while others tried to resume normal routines. He wanted to reassure them, but he also knew he could not reveal his plans. His calm presence became a silent anchor. People might not understand the danger or his preparation, but his demeanor reassured them. He had learned that strength was often invisible, and sometimes the quietest person could hold the most control. Then came the moment to act subtly. He began implementing small disruptions, careful maneuvers that made the vandals hesitate without ever putting him in direct confrontation. He would block access to certain paths, leave subtle clues that they were being watched, and create barriers that slowed their movement. Each action was nonviolent yet effective. The vandals' confidence began to crumble, their sense of control weakening with every day. He also anticipated escalation. The vandals might respond to his subtle interventions with more aggression. He had plans for that as well. Escape routes, safe zones, and ways to monitor their actions without risk were all in place. He could act decisively if necessary, but the goal was to manage the situation intelligently rather than escalate it unnecessarily. Every step was measured, every choice deliberate. At the same time, he documented everything meticulously. Cameras captured movement, notes recorded patterns and evidence.